This is Polyamory Weekly, episode 588 for December 5th, 2020. Coming up on today's show, where the fuck have we been? That's coming up on today's show. Hello, everyone. I am Minx, and I'm here with our favorite co-host, Lusty Guy.
Hello, everybody. My favorite co-host, anyway, as I like to say.
And today's show, as you can tell from the title, is talking about where the fuck we've been. We haven't published for 8 months.
8 months.
Yeah.
Dun, 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 dun.
For those who may be listening for the first time, a word of warning. This is an adult show about really lascivious things like honesty and communication about sex. So if you're under 18, please stop listening and visit scarletteen.com. Also, you may have noticed we're going to fucking swear a little bit in this episode.
That's nothing new.
Now, if you listen to our episode 587 from back in March, we did mention that we got a new puppy. And that is one of the reasons why we haven't published for 8 months.
You know, raising dogs is in the same family as raising children. It's not as hard. I've done both, don't get me wrong, and nor as rewarding, but it's close. You can see child rearing from dog rearing, and puppies in particular demand a lot of attention and time, particularly the way that I raise them, you know, which really requires a lot of attention.
And this particular puppy... Now, I've never raised a puppy before. I'm a cat person, so I don't know. But it seems to me like this dog is, I don't know, about 1,000, 2,000 times as much work as a cat.
Well, yeah, no, quite a bit more than a cat. That's true. We got our rescue dog. Now, I grew up with gun dogs and hound dogs and hunting dogs, and those dogs, generally speaking, excepting maybe labs, they like to run for an hour or so a day, and then they're happy just sitting down and being mellow and sleeping for a good chunk of the day. Like our last dog, which you knew, Mara. Mara would sleep literally 15, 16 hours a day.
Ah, sounds wonderful.
Now, this dog, Baloo's a rescue dog. And Baloo, he's a rescue dog, but he's definitely got a little pit in him, which I also have had. They're great. He's got a little bit of lab in him, I think. He's got a little bit of corgi in him. He might have a little bit of border collie in him, all of which adds up to him being really smart and wanting a job and something to do.
He keeps trying to herd the cat.
He herds everybody.
It's true.
Yeah, he wants to herd everybody. He knows already a dozen tricks. He's not particularly obedient in the face of distraction, but he's a puppy. I wouldn't be surprised if in another year he becomes much more obedient in the face of distraction, but we'll see.
He is a really good dog, as long as there's not a squirrel, a crow, another dog, a truck, another person.
If that other person is one of the people who gives him treats and he knows.
That's true.
Yeah, no, but he takes time. In fact, after Elle and I had our first child, I love to tell this story. When our first child was our spawn, as he likes to be called, was a few years old, Elle looked at me and said, you know, I'm kind of thinking about having another. And I looked at her and said, let's get a puppy. And if, after having had a puppy for a year or so, you still want another kid, we'll talk about it. Yeah, that never happened. Spawn was the only child. A year of having a puppy broke from wanting another kid, and that was that.
There you go. So that's one reason. It's a lot more work than I'm used to. Another reason is that this COVID pandemic has, I don't want to say hit me pretty hard because nobody in our family has gotten sick, although
that's not true.
You were deathly sick in February before we knew about COVID. And from those symptoms, we all think that you actually had COVID back in February.
It's possible. As I've described him to she who cannot be named, who's a lawyer, she's like, yep, sounds like COVID to me. But nobody else got it in the family, which is unlikely if it were COVID. And having said that, though, I have friends, and you have friends, close friends, who have been severely impacted. An old high school teacher of mine was Montana's first COVID casualty. We are luckily in our immediate circle and appreciative of the fact that we're uninfected, and our hearts go out to everybody else who can't say that. Having said that, it has been an emotional drain on you.
It really has been. I have at this count 15 friends who have COVID and are in the process of recovering. And I think the hardest part for me is seeing COVID being made into a political issue. I find it infuriating that science has become political and the mask conspiracists. And as we follow the numbers day in and day out, I have spent the last 8 months feeling helpless and frustrated. We've got over 250,000 families mourning the loss. As of this recording, there are 3,000 deaths a day, practically doing one 9/11 of deaths every day. We still have people in denial. As I said, I've got over a dozen friends recovering from this, and it's heartbreaking and infuriating that, at least in the US, our government is basically sitting by and doing nothing. It was really hard to get behind the microphone and talk about, metamor relations and how do I have sex during a pandemic when the scale of this was so huge. I've just been personally kind of overwhelmed and crushed. And while grateful that I can work from home and I didn't lose any income, it's just been a really bizarre thing to live in. And I just couldn't bring myself to get behind the mic.
It is truly interesting times. There's no two ways about it.
Another thing that made it difficult is that I'm sure we're not the only ones where the pandemic has affected not just my emotional health, but our relationship as well. With COVID, with a puppy, the lack of privacy from not being able to go anywhere else. Basically, we have been sheltering in place. I haven't set foot inside a place that wasn't our house or maybe the convenience store for 5 minutes in 8 months. There were definitely points when our relationship was not great. It was strained and we were just not being very nice to each other.
Well, I think that and that's probably true for anybody out there who has been stuck in with their primary, secondary, whatever, main partners and unnamed partners, however you want to label it. Nesting partners, anchor partners, lovers, whatever. It's a major disruption and a major stressor, which is going to express itself in people's relations. Now, I want to say two things about this. To anybody out there who has experienced actual violence and relationship abuse, we're not talking about that. And I want to acknowledge that when we say we haven't been nice to each other, we're not talking about the kind of not nice to each other that you may have experienced. It's more grumpiness, not listening to each other well, being argumentative, losing that rule of trying to assume goodwill, and things like that. It's not like there was any violence or abuse or anything like that going on. And I'm cognizant that in these times of stress, those incidents have gone up. So if you are enduring something like that, again, heart goes out to you. We're not there. And I want to make sure that anybody who is there knows that I see you and you'll get through. You deserve better.
And absolutely, if you are in that situation, of course, as we always say, please do things to keep yourself safe.
So as these stress levels have gone up around us, generally speaking, we all have our particular strategies for dealing with them. I'm lucky in that mine, masturbation and diving, have largely been made of, and smoking dope.
It makes it sound like you do those things together.
Maybe. Not in cold water. No, not in cold water. But in any case, I'm relatively lucky in that my major sources of stress, dealing with stress, have been available to me. But that hasn't been true for Minx. The things that Minx likes to do in the face of stress aren't things you can do in a time of COVID. For example,
yeah, my key coping mechanisms are swimming, which just physically helps my body feel wonderful, more so than any other exercise I can do. And since my gym is an indoor pool, I haven't seen my gym in 8 months, which is the longest time I've gone without being in a pool in the last 30 years. Now, that has been mitigated, or it was mitigated for a month or two with the introduction of that new app, Swimply, which is where people can share their outdoor swimming pools and you can rent them by the hour. Unfortunately, there were only a couple of pools in the area. I really enjoyed it for the month that I did have access to outdoor pools. It was really wonderful. Most of them are closed down for the winter, though, so Back to nothing there. One of my outlets is dressing up and going out. So dressing up in my sparkly 1920s dresses or 50s dresses, putting together a beautiful outfit, taking pictures, going out. Can't do any of that, of course. Now, yeah. I know I could still do dressing up and taking pictures, but it seems like a lot of effort for not going out and doing something. It just doesn't work for me. And then also, the other thing is, again, with the design, I really love playing with home design and thinking about adding a new rug or changing the sofa cushions. And basically with the puppy, I'm not able to do most of that because pretty much everything I bring into the house, Peace's going to destroy. So that's not completely gone, but it's severely limited. So yeah, and I feel like very whiny for saying this, but it's just to say that those are my coping mechanisms and I don't have access to them. So considering that I don't have access to coping mechanisms, I've actually been doing pretty well.
I'm still alive. I think so.
And the last thing that made it really hard to podcast was with the George Floyd, I'm going to call it murder, and the Black Lives Matters protests and the protests against the growing police violence. Politics, which I've never really cared out before, like the last 4 years or so, has really become all consuming. Here in Seattle, the anarchist jurisdiction, we had Chaz Chop, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or the Capitol Hill Occupied Protest. We were labeled anarchists. The feds were in town. They were tear gassing children. They were not stopping people who were running over protesters, some of whom are my friends. And I'm sitting here standing by while these brainwashed, make America great again people are just running over people in the street and calling us Antifa, like being anti-fascist is a bad thing now. And you could tell I'm getting kind of worked up. It's just been so incredibly frustrating. So that means that, yeah, getting behind the mic and talking about dealing with metamoral relations and how to tell someone you like them, it just seemed unimportant in scale. And I do know it is important. I just couldn't bring myself to do it for a while.
Well, and as I think any of our long-term listeners know, really, even though I've got co-producer credit, this is Cunning Minx's show. Cunning Minx is the heart and soul of Polly Weekly. And in the final analysis, Cunning Minx is what makes us go, to quote some Star Trek Next Generation and go way back. If she wasn't driving, it wasn't happening. And I really want to say that not to pile on or say it's all her fault, because everybody knows I don't even believe in fault, I hope. But instead to say that this actually became, I think, a wonderful expression of self-care and self-love on Minx's part. When I say love, I define it as treating the object of your affections well when it is difficult to do so. Now, this 8-month hiatus has put Minx in a very bad spot because she is a woman who likes her schedules, who wants to achieve things on the timeline upon which they are supposed to be achieved by God. But she's been running on emotional reserves and fumes. And so for her to give herself permission to relax that schedule-driven part of her personality, to allow herself to do a little bit of self-care and treat herself well when it is hard to do, actually, I think is a great example of self-love and something that I respect quite a bit. So when the heart and soul has got to take a little time off to heal, the rest of the body takes time off too. And that's a good thing.
Well, thank you for saying that, baby. It makes me feel a little bit better. It was hard not to publish, but I really needed not to. That being said, this is our comeback show.
Dun-da-da.
We're going to get back on schedule. We're going to start podcasting with pretty close to the regular that we have promised. So what is going to be different moving forward?
We're going to talk politics. I mean, that's the short answer. The long answer is that this awakening, if you will, if I can use the term that Minx has made her want to incorporate a political awareness into this programming and take advantage of the podium that you all have created for us. Now, for myself, I got politically activated in the 1980s around the issue of U.S. involvement in Latin America. Take a little while and research, the School of the Americas, if you really want to learn something that's going to make you ashamed of what we have done. And as a young man in the teenage years, I started getting into that. And that political activation has stayed with me throughout my adult life. And I've been a student of U.S. history throughout my adult life. I've literally spent time with what was in the Aryan nations, or the Order. These are very far right-wing paramilitary organizations. Now we call them militias. And some big names in those movements at that time. And so I've been cognizant, and by the way, not as a trainee, just to make that clear. I've been cognizant of this for my adult life. And to see this most recent of expression doesn't shock and surprise me the way that it has many people. In fact, I see it as a continuation of a pattern that needs to be addressed. And it needs to be addressed, I think, by dismantling the assumption that we don't talk about politics. When I started a porn company, and believe me, porn and politics have a lot to do with each other. When I started a porn company, I did so to achieve 3 goals: to have fun, to do good, and to make money. And I think I helped contribute a little bit, just a little bit, to the movement that we've had in this nation that has allowed us to discuss sexuality with an openness and a frankness that didn't exist in the 1980s and 90s. And I think we're better for it. To that same end, I think we have to learn how to talk about politics with each other. And I'm not, by the way, advocating that whole build bridges with people who disagree with you. There is nothing wrong with letting the choir practice. Preach to the choir. That's just fine. They need to work together and practice together sometimes too. But we have to start preaching, and we have to start listening. We have to start talking about politics and disagreeing about it and bringing it out into the light.
Yeah, I like the idea of demystifying talking about politics, much as we have worked to demystify talking about sex. It is pretty funny that to me, it is harder to talk about politics than it is to talk about sex. And I'm probably not the only one who feels that way. I've come to believe over the last few years that it really is true that the personal is political. What we talk about in terms of our sex lives, in terms of our right to protest, in terms of making science-based decisions, this is all political and it's all personal.
So in the spirit of talking politics, one of the things that I hate when I hear political commentators talk is that they don't actually take a firm stand and they don't present calls of action. It'll be all analysis on what the polls are as if it's meaningless. It's not meaningless. There is a difference between the two sides. And we have a very important election coming up in Georgia with a lot of things riding on it. So I'm going to just absolutely say that if you have an interest in U.S. outcomes, if you think 250,000 dead for what was reported to be a Democratic hoax when in the early stages by the Trump administration, then help out Georgia. Give a little bit of money if you don't live there directly to the campaigns involved. Phone bank. Talk to your friends about it. Reach out to Stacey Abrams' organization.
Fair Fight.
And give them some love. Spread news around them through the internet. Start talking with your friends and family. And Georgia is the first place to start talking about because so much rides on it.
Agreed. All that being said, the name of the show is still Poly Weekly. And while we're not weekly, we're going to twice a month, as we have been, we are still about polyamory. The show is still ultimately about how to communicate better in whatever relationship you have. So we'll still be talking about your metamor relations and safer sex and communicating with your partner and poly dating and writing your user manual and all of that. We're still going to have the happy poly moments and poly in the news and your feedback and advice. But we will also be talking about politics in as much as they affect us, especially the GLBTQIA plus and BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and those who love them. Now, we understand that this may not be everybody's cup of tea, and that's okay. The good news is there are several other poly podcasts you can listen to if you don't already. The Multi-Amory podcast is really good. Esther Perel has a great podcast about sex and relationships. Or, of course, you can be poly podcastress and listen to all of the podcasts or none. That's okay. I absolutely will not take it personally if you choose not to listen because politics aren't your thing. It's just what we feel we have to do in order to be able to continue. Now, Lustig, I had to step out because the dog walker is back with the dog, so you're just left with me. I do, of course, hope that you keep listening and keep telling your friends. Well, that's going to wrap it up for today's comeback show. We'll be back to our regular format, plus politics, for our next show, episode 589. So it's me saying thanks for listening, and remember, it's not all about the sex.